Welcome to Intesa San Paolo on Air, the English Language Insight series produced in conjunction with the University of Oxford, where we embark on global conversations with global leaders. My name is Rupert Younger, and in this, our 12th episode, I am in conversation with Rachel Botsman, talking about her new art installation celebrating the design story behind the first company organisation chart. I first met Rachel when she was a trust scholar at Oxford, following the revelation that our two first-time authored books were going to be published on the very same date back in 2018. This bonded us together in some strange competitive way, and we've since connected on mutual themes relating to reputation and trust. What started as mutual wary competition has evolved into a firm professional respect and friendship. And to my ears, I was absolutely fascinated when I read her article in the Financial Times outlining how she's approaching this intriguing design story. Org charts, as they're most commonly called, are used in businesses and institutions all across the world. They are structured as a diagram that shows the structure of an organisation and the relationship and ranks of its different parts and positions or jobs. Typically, you would see today a hierarchical org chart, one where a small group of board members is at the top, a slightly larger group of senior executives below that, and then a series of functional and divisional reporting positions that flow like an A-line skirt below that. But org charts also come in different forms too. There are matrix structures which show a series of often confusing interconnected reporting lines that cross over each other, and flat or horizontal org charts where there are hardly any hierarchies at all. So given all this, it may at first glance seem strange to be talking here with Rachel on the origin story of the first organisation chart. And what on earth does trust, Rachel's backstory, have to do with an org chart? Well, we're about to find out. Welcome, Rachel.
It's great to be here. And thanks for that lovely introduction and the journey, the arrival to this.
Well, it was definitely a really, really fun last few years getting to know you and understand the really brilliant work that you do around trust. And for those of you who are interested, there's a lot of work that Rachel has done on the Oxford website around trust, and it's brilliant stuff. But it's so interesting now to be able to talk to you about this new chapter in your life, this move into design thinking. So first off, Rachel, describe simply what listeners to this podcast cannot see. Describe in a visual way what this installation, this art installation is that you have set up at the London Design Biennale.
It's extraordinary, and it's the opposite of the top-down pyramid that you were describing. So the easiest way to imagine it is think of a really beautiful willow tree. And at the base are its roots. And the thing that struck me first is that the board and the leadership team are the roots. So it's an inversion of power and hierarchy. And they sit within these really solid circles. And then coming out from the board are these branches. And I should say it was created for the railways, which I know we're going to get into, but that is quite significant because each branch represents a railway. And then off these railways are all these different roles. And as I've started to restore the thing, I've realized the level of detail and thinking. So every single role from the wipers and the stokers and the engineers and the repairmen is mapped on, and their relationship to each other. And then I didn't see this until it became big. They've also mapped on the number of people in each of those roles. So you'll have like 33 wipers and 2 foremen. And then what's so beautiful about this thing is it all flows into the board and the leadership team. And so it's this really interesting artifact in thinking completely differently about accountability, about leadership, about frontline workers, and about trust. And it took me a while to make this connection, but a lot of my work is about the shift from sort of institutional top-down trust to distributed trust. And I was like, someone was thinking about this 170 years ago. I have to find out this story. And that's been the 2-year journey.
So we ought to probably back up and just talk about what is this artefact. Just explain what this artefact is and how you came across it in the first place.
So now you've got sort of a picture of this tree. To give you the context, it was created in 1855. It was a collaboration between two men, Daniel McCallum and this draftsman called George Henshaw. And to give you the context, they were, one was the superintendent of a railroads and the other was an engineer.
And the railroads here we're talking about, are they in the UK? But they're not. They're in New York, right?
They're the New York Erie Railroad. And if you think about what was happening in 1855, it's not a mirror, but there are real synergies as to what we're going through today. So there was the invention of synchronized time because of the railroads, which is an incredible invention when you think about it. The introduction of the telegraph. So suddenly people had information, but it didn't create order, it created chaos. And the challenge that McCallum faced was that he, for the first time, had to manage over 4,000 people across 400 miles of track, and he couldn't see them. And this doesn't sound extraordinary, but in the day, they were used to running mom and pop stores. So organizations may have been up to like 50 people. You could know them by name. You could see what they were doing. Again, he was struggling with a distributed workforce, which is actually a really sort of common relevant problem. And so he didn't think of himself this way, but he was really one of the first management scholars because this was before business schools and thinkers like Peter Drucker. He'd never described himself in this way. Like he was this quite charismatic man with this long flowing beard, and he was actually a poet. And you can see that in the way he visualized and described things. And so he sat down with his draftsman and said, we've got this problem that people don't understand what each other are doing. And it was causing deaths because if you don't know each other's roles, then trains are going to crash into one another. And he was like, we've got to solve this. So it's really remarkable if you think they were like, we could visualize roles and they invented a vernacular. They invented job titles. These are extraordinary ways of thinking. And they sat down and they created the first ever org chart.
And as you say, it's a rather remarkable thing of beauty to look at because it's not straight lines and reporting structures up and down and across. It's this rather beautiful piece of art architecture.
So this is the other thing that struck me is it feels alive and it feels like it reflects sort of the complexities of human relationships, whether that's in life or at work. And I always think, why is so much of business design language boxes and straight lines? Because that life is messy, right? And so this thing is very fluid. It doesn't move in its original form. But in my interpretation, I wanted to literally bring it to life, which is why I've taken it away from paper. And it's very large now. So it's over 3 meters and it's in engraved acrylic. And what happens is it sits in a very dark room and light comes through it and you can read the details through the shadows and the patterns. And that's intentional because it's meant to represent that work, like life, is fluid and these relationships change. And a lot of the problems that I see in organizations wearing my trust scholar hat is people find it very hard to adapt. They find it very hard when roles shift and change, when leadership dynamics change. And that's because we tend to think of things in these linear, fixed boxes. So it is, I think when people see it, they're very touched by nature and how organic it is. They're very touched by how delicate it is, but they're very touched by how every role is treated with the same level of respect. So it's not like the board or his secretary that they have different icons. They each have like a different design language within the thing, but they're all treated with very intentional care and detail.
I'm going to come back to this fluidity and this idea of channeling nature in a moment. But just, I'm kind of intrigued. How did you find this extraordinary artifact in the first place?
Well, I should also say the other thing it's not chaos, and that's really important. There is structure in there. So it's not without boundaries. It's very thoughtful. How did I come across it? So probably like you, I was being asked a lot of questions about the future of work, particularly in relationship to AI and disruption and change and uncertainty. And I was honestly finding it hard, Rupert, to get beyond the noise and starting to say, does anyone really know how work is going to change and how our lives are going to change? So maybe to actually understand the future, we need to go to the past. And what struck me was the mid-19th century was this time, not just complexity, but scale. The railroads were the last massive investment we made in rethinking infrastructure and how people move and supply and demand. And so I was like, there's got to be interesting things from that time of how people thought about productivity and how they thought about efficiency and all these things that have come to define work. So I wanted to find these work artifacts, and I honestly didn't know what I was going to discover. And then I discovered this treasure trove. And what is so incredible is that these people, they weren't in business schools, they weren't management professors. Many of them were musicians, composers, artists, poets, engineers. They thought visually, they felt things. And because of that, they were very good at expressing their ideas through visual diagrams. And so I started to dig, and I found them in library archives. And I started to reach out to the librarians. I'd never had that kind of interaction, some of it positive, some of it really challenging. And I was like, why do you want to keep them buried? Like, no one's seen these things. Release them into the world. And I mean, you do know me, I never give up. So with this one, I realized there was a different librarian every day of the week that would answer the emails. So I finally got through to someone. I can't say his name, but I can't. His last name was Kipling, and it wasn't Rudyard. It was close. And he was like, well, of course you can use it. It's out of copyright, right? You don't actually need permission. And how wonderful that you're going to bring it to life and bring it out into the world. And that was 2 years ago, and I didn't know anything about the process of restoration, design world, biennales. And so in many ways, it was a new journey for me as well.
And I mean, so you say it's not chaos, and it celebrated this idea of equality. It celebrated fluidity and this idea of mutual respect of roles. These sound very modern concepts to me, and very much needed in today's slightly sort of fractured world. But how innovative was it back in the day?
It's such a good question. And there's very little written about it. And so there is a shareholder report that is the response of the board and the directors to this thing. And what's interesting was that they made McCallum write principles to go with the visual artifact. So we had to come up with 6 management principles that help people understand their roles, which also are surprisingly modern. So a lot of them are about accountability and empowerment, clarity and communications. But yet there's very little documentation of how the workers responded to it. What we do know is that it took 60 years from the creation of that org chart for the next org chart to appear in 1916. And that was by a gentleman called Henry Thale. And he was a management theorist. And the org chart was forever destroyed because he came up with the pyramid and the boxes and the linear thinking. So he took the concept of visualizing roles in an organization, but it was to remind people who was in charge. And that org chart is very well documented. And then what I love, being a slight geek around this stuff, was the next one was pretty close, was the Tabular Computing Company, which became IBM. And they said, great, there's something that can put people in boxes. And they invented the pyramid. So I don't know if we've got IBM to blame, but it never got challenged again. And I find that extraordinary, the gap between the original and then how they interpreted that into this like really modern linear fixed language.
So the setting of this was obviously in critical infrastructure. This was life-threatening stuff if you got it wrong. If the trains were on the same track heading in the wrong way, there was going to be problems. So the visual architecture was designed really around safety and communication. And that, you're saying, really stayed as a model for effectively 70 years till 1916. Was that reflected in the way businesses ran themselves then? Did businesses run themselves as organic, almost egalitarian, respectful institutions during that time? Or actually was this just a particular thing that related to this type of industry, do you think?
It's a really good question. The answer is no. I mean, people were still learning, right? This was the industrial age where business was changing. And my assumption of what happened was because there was chaos and it is so hard to manage people when you can't see them, that's why they defaulted to this top-down command and control that actually what the org chart was encouraging is very hard to do, where you do empower people and you do sort of gain control by giving up control. Like these principles we still see today that we know that people want them, but leaders struggle with them. So it wasn't that it was the solution. That's not what I'm trying to celebrate. What I'm trying to celebrate is it really is, I think it's a form of genius to actually go, we can visually describe roles and use nature as our motif, which was really common in Victorian times.
Yeah, and of course that's now coming back as well. So I want to come on to today in a minute, but before we get there, can I just anchor back to just get you to dig into a bit more about how this relates to the way that trust works in organizational settings?
Yeah.
I find it utterly fascinating. This feels like a very, very distributed trust model. Just run us through the trust thinking.
So, and as I said, I find how work connects with your work really fascinating, how threads join together. And this did not hit me for quite a long time. So what I study is how this idea that trust isn't being destroyed, it's not in decline, it changes form. And that a lot of the disruption happening in our lives is because we are in one of the biggest trust shifts of all time. And so my assumption, which has been challenged by this artifact, is that trust has sort of worked in this local, institutional, and distributed chapters, in these chapters. And the distributed trust really took the pyramid, the hierarchy, and distributes it out through networks and platforms and marketplaces. And, you see that in things like Airbnb and Uber and marketplaces like eBay and Etsy, but also in how organizations are having to reorganize themselves. But it was there in 1855. That's what McCallum was saying, is that if I cannot see everyone because they are spread over 500 miles of track, I have to trust them. And trust cannot be bounded by a physical office or a store at the time. Trust cannot be based on me seeing what people are doing every day, that it's not about that command and control. It's actually about getting those people to trust one another whose roles are connected. And the thing I also love is he thought a lot about physical geography and location. So he realized that trust wasn't going to flow across these tracks, that it was very much rooted to a region because they could take responsibility for one flow of the track, but saying actually you've got to take responsibility for the whole network was not how they thought about accountability, because every day they were physically walking up and down or moving up and down that one track, which I also love, this idea that what you see and what you experience, you have a very different relationship with. And so I think sometimes in organizations, they become too big. And so what McCallum was doing was finding like smallness within that bigness and creating these like microcosms of trust structures. So he was so far ahead of his time in thinking about distributed trust that, again, it wasn't just like a jellyfish. It wasn't like just moving in all these different directions. It wasn't completely chaotic. It had to have structure, and it had to be tied to location, and it had to be at a scale where people could still see one another and know one another versus the entire organization.
I also really like the way you put that, because it speaks to some work that you've been doing at Oxford, we've been trying to also do here, which is this idea of what can the humanities teach business? What can art and culture teach business? We do some work here with a conductor, where we bring a conductor in and we get the conductor to work with executives to teach them that command and control structures are not the way to get high-performing teams. What a conductor does is he accepts that everyone's good at what they do. His job or her job is to allow them to be the best people they can. And it feels to me that this particular structure celebrates that style, that this artifact that you've uncovered, it really is distributed trust, but it's also sees the leadership almost as a conductor, trusting people across and through the network, that respect, allowing people to do what they do best. Is that
No,
is
and
that correct? Is that how we should see this?
yeah, no, and if you when you look at the design, you'll see it's very intentional that the board and then the leadership team are circular, and that it does kind of look like the center of a stage where they are sort of radiating outwards. My next sort of obsession is actually with a conductor also called Karol Kaminski, who was a Polish conductor, but was one of the first to visualize how supply and demand could work in organizations. So your point on the humanities and the arts is we didn't divide these disciplines back then, right? It was very natural that people were philosophers and artists and musicians and scientists, and they were truly polymaths in the way that they thought and the way that they expressed themselves, which, as you know, I'm such a huge advocate that that's the way business schools need to move, because they will become the most important thinkers again.
I agree. I mean, we've spoken about this before, but this idea of separating into silos seems a nice way to think about segmenting and producing focused work, but it doesn't reflect how organizations actually work in practice. And so I think it's a very strange thing to do. That leads us to come to this question of visualization and design thinking. So you've talked about this exhibition and this installation as design thinking. Let's start with what is design thinking?
It's a bit like trust. It's one of those questions that is really hard to answer. And I think I'll have a different answer in 2 years. I think design thinking is a way of visualizing questions as much as problems. It's a way of taking very complex things and bringing a clarity to them, not making them simple, but making very complex things clear. That is design thinking at its best. And it's very hard to find another language that does that so well, where you can take so many parts and pieces and visually express them in a way that cuts across cultural boundaries, educational boundaries, language boundaries, and that people, they can cognitively respond to it, but also emotionally respond to it. So that for me is design thinking. I think a lot of people actually think of design thinking as solving problems, but really good design thinkers, they surface the questions that other people may not be looking at. And this, it's funny, I've only actually just made the connection talking to you, because I started my education at the Ruskin up the road at the art school, and I was trained to think in this way. And then I don't know why, but I threw myself into business school. So then I went to like Harvard, and I was always this fish out of water. And so I think some way I've like found my tribe in these people from the mid 19th century. But I've always thought through a design lens, which is a different from, I should say, an art lens, where you're trying to express an idea or bring something to life. Design thinking is very much focused around questions and problems and clarity to complexity.
Yeah, simplifying to the point where you can see actually see what matters. And that feels also extremely contemporary, because the complexity now of the ecosystems around organizations mean that understanding the pressure points, the opportunities, it's even more complex than it's ever been. And I'm struck also, and maybe you are too, that nature is coming back as a particular design lens. This idea of regenerative capitalism, for example, the idea of what can we do around recycling, upcycling, circular economy work. These are all natural. These are nature concepts, right? Is that how we should think about this? I mean, you've obviously, this design, this extraordinary design you've unearthed looks like a tree or a plant or some sort of organic matter. Should we be thinking more about nature? Is this a way to think about organizations as nature components?
Yeah, so the tree is called the Salix caprea. It's based on it. Actually grows next to the railroads. I told you it's very geeky to know this, but they saw it every day. So that was their design prompt. But it's no coincidence they picked a tree, because a tree is such a complex living ecosystem. So I prefer that word to nature. I think what's we're looking for is ecosystems are so incredible at finding equilibriums. They're so incredible at readdressing when they're out of whack or imbalance. And even the way you think about, I'm a gardener, so the way you think about seasons and cycles, right? It doesn't try to be active all year round. Like I always find that amazing where the garden is completely dormant and looks like mud, and then March, right, it bursts into life. And you think about work, but we try to work to the same rhythm. We try to do the same work all year round. So I think it's like, okay, what we're doing doesn't work, both in terms of sustainability, the way we think about resources. And then we're also thinking about on a human level that the way we think about productivity and maximizing efficiency, these are like very mechanical, factory-driven machine terms, what IBM did with the org chart, that don't actually work for human beings. So I think it's because we've got stuck, both in terms of the systems and then the people within those systems. And the common problem I hear all leaders talking about is, I don't know how to organize people anymore. It's as simple as that. Like it manifests itself in lots of complex ways, but how do you organize people? Now they might say, I want to get the best out of them, or they don't show up, or they're disengaged. And so I think we're looking for alternative ways to reframe that problem and turning to other ecosystems.
So that leads me really to bring it up to date. What are the design thinking questions that we need to address today?
Oh, there's so many. I think in the context of the business world, what is work? Like that is a really big design thinking question. What is work? What is the role of work in our lives? And what is people's relationship to work is one. The second, I have this issue with this focus on AI and skills and jobs, because the other design thinking challenge is thinking habits. So I observed this in my peers and my friends. The number of people tell me they've stopped reading books or their attention spans have gone. And all the research shows is that we've plateaued in cognitive thinking, literacy, numeracy skills. So if people, and this is only going to get worse with AI. So if people are outsourcing their thinking now to technology, what are the skills going to be? Those skills are going to go back to design thinking, right? To visualization, to that connection between the hand and the brain, that people that can physically and visually represent things. So that's a second one, is I think people are worried about, and it's rightly so, job losses and job titles versus really thinking about thinking habits that we need to instill in people. And then the third big one, I mean, there's so many, the way we think about scale and the way we think about interconnection, it's not working, whether that's in a political sphere, which I think is what we're finding so challenging in terms of the uncertainty around how the plates are moving around geopolitics. Large companies are suddenly saying, does the scale work in their favor, both in terms of their cultures and their supply chains and how they have to move things when they're at the disposal of a president? So scale is another really big issue. Like, have things got too big? How do we find that smallness within that bigness again? So they would be my three. Like, what is work and the role of work? Do we need to be thinking differently about thinking? And then the complexities that come with scale.
And just very briefly, what's your guidance to leaders as to how to use design thinking to address those questions? What can they practically do?
That's a good question. One, I would say, do you have the George Henshaw on your team, right? Like, so that didn't happen by chance. They worked with each other and visualized things and drew things together. So you've probably got a great communications person. I'm not sure many leaders interact with their designers, right? They probably think it is the brand or the communications department, but who visually thinks alongside you would be my first piece of advice. And then the second is outside of product design, so where it manifests itself in something beautiful and physical, whether that's your logo, your marketing, what role does design thinking play? Now, that's not new. Like Tim Brown's been talking about that from IDEO. But what I found is it still gets lost in innovation and the marketing teams versus at the board and the leadership level, how they're visualizing problems and thinking through things.
I think that's really very interesting. Thank you, Rachel, for this wonderful conversation. I feel not just enlightened, but also invigorated. Invigorated also to look again at our history as a guide to today and the future, and more specifically to the way that our forebears created artefacts that are as contemporary today as they were when they were made. So for anyone interested in taking this particular discussion further, subscribe to Rachel's Substack, Rethink with Rachel, or get involved through her Kickstarter campaign called Roots of Trust, and perhaps also dig into your own company archives to see what treasures you can find. Thank you very much. Until next time.